Welcome back to EDIT 640. It's Joe again, here to present this week's module on audio production basics. In this lesson, we'll continue our previous conversations on indoor and outdoor acoustics and how they affect the production workflow. We'll review the major categories of microphone types to understand when each is appropriate. And finally, we'll review some essential tips for capturing clean audio. We've learned in previous assignments that every production site, indoor and outdoor, has its own acoustic signature. In most professional productions, multiple microphones are often used and channeled into a mixer, where adjustments can be made dynamically by a sound engineer who's listening through headphones. But of course, for low-budget instructional productions, we don't always have that luxury. We don't always have the luxury of using a multi-mic shoot setup, so instead, we have to pay a lot more close attention on choosing the correct microphone for the context. For example, take a look at the image up in the top left-hand corner where we have an interview. You have most likely a lavalier mic attached to each of the subjects, and then above them you have a directional mic that's being hovered just out of frame while the interview is being conducted. The combination of these two run into a mixer or run into the same camera. Some cameras can sustain two inputs, and those are then mixed appropriately. In the top right-hand corner, in this video right here, this is a typical Hollywood setup where you're shooting a sitcom or a dramatic scene or a recreation. These subjects are not going to be mic'd with a lavalier microphone because that'll make too much noise. Instead, you have up top, you have a boom operator with a directional mic pointing at the subjects while they're being recorded. This frees up the subjects, or the actors in this case, to walk around without creating additional noise ruffling into the microphone. Now, wind noise, of course, is a very common issue to deal with outside. And you can see in this bottom photo on the left-hand side here, we have a big windsock or windscreen wrapped around the directional microphone right here. But the subject in this case is being shot from behind. You can see the camera right here, and so we have a behind the subject type of shot, profile shot as they call it. And in the background, unfortunately, we have this boat, which is most likely making noise. So in this particular setup, because we're using a directional microphone right here pointing at the subject, the amount of volume that's being detected from this passing boat is diminished, but it's still going to be there. And so the producers will have to have a plan for how to deal with this once they're in the editing bay, especially if this camera right here is shooting an interview segment. Perhaps there's another camera on the right-hand side that's shooting their face as they're speaking. This is most likely the case, and in that particular scenario, the subject would have to have a lavalier mic on them as well, and that would have to carry the majority of the audio so that we could hear them over this boat. Nevertheless, the directional mic right here is going to capture this boat and the other ambient noises that are out there that help establish the setting. That's easy to see as well on the right-hand side here, where you have an oceanside interview segment with subjects sitting on a couch. You have a directional mic up top right here being held by and manipulated by a boom operator, and then they have lavalier microphones on them as well. Again, the lav mics are probably going to be the ones that carry the majority of the audio gain, and the directional mic up above is capturing more of the ambient noise. And the combination of those two creates a very authentic interview setting. Now again, we don't always have that luxury of being able to use all of these different mics, so we need to pick our microphones very carefully, and we'll take a look at that in an upcoming slide. Let's talk about reverb. The way a room is constructed or furnished definitely affects how it sounds. Some rooms are hot and others are cool, depending on the kind of materials that are inside the actual room. For example, cinder block walls, hardwood flooring, and even marble or granite countertops all contribute to making a room sound what audio technicians call hot, meaning it's very echoey. And to hear this, all you have to do is walk into any room and clap your hands. And if you hear that minor echo, that means the room is hot and you need to use some sound dampening material to try to diminish that echo. In this shot we see here in this studio recording, there's foam padding up on the walls We also have soft ceiling tiles up above, all of which combine to help diminish the sound. Now, this foam padding, unfortunately, is pretty expensive, so what's a low-budget alternative? Well, it's real easy. All you have to do is hang curtains or even blankets. If you have old wool blankets, stick them up, tack them up on the wall, and it'll work just fine. It may not look the best, so you may have to put a different set in front of that to try to get the shot that you need. But if you're just recording audio, then that wouldn't matter anyway. So you have to think about that as you design your sets. But blankets are a great cheap alternative to cut down on room reverb, so please remember that. Microphones. Oh boy, we have so many different mics that we can choose from. Most of these are not terribly expensive, or at least there are inexpensive options that teachers can certainly afford to use for their productions. Obviously, they can get incredibly expensive on Hollywood level or professional level productions, and that's simply beyond the means of what we're trying to do in our projects. But nevertheless, even cheap ones will sound much better than the microphone that's built into your camera. The reason we don't want to use the microphone on the camera, among other things, is that it picks up way too much ambient noise. It does not allow you to get close enough to the subject to pick up their audio very well, and also in many cases it'll pick up hums and hisses and other machine noises coming from the camera itself. Now, you don't find this really from cell phones, but especially from larger cameras, and especially with tape-driven cameras, which we don't really use anymore. But nevertheless, all of this underscores the need to have an external microphone, and here are some of the most common options. The first one, of course, is the shotgun mic, which is a directional mic, usually mounted to the camera or on a boom. And this is really good to use when you have a boom operator who can hold the microphone just out of frame, as close to the subject as possible, and especially for moving subjects where they would make rustling noises with their clothing rubbing up against a lavalier microphone. Now, speaking of lavalier microphones, obviously their best application is for stationary subjects, especially interviews. And the trick there is to run the microphone cable up on the inside of the shirt and then out one button slot below the collar. That's typically the best zone to put that. You also want to put a windscreen on top of that. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Handheld microphones everybody's familiar with. These are directional mics typically, and they can be obviously handheld or they can be put in a mic stand. These are best used for hosted productions where the host is actually on camera and usually conducting a live, spontaneous interview, something that's a lot less scripted than a studio interview. Headset microphones have improved dramatically over the years, and many of them are very, very low profile now. We see these a lot in exercise videos, in infomercials, or any other application where the host is very, very active, especially with their arms moving around, to the point where a traditional lavalier mic that's lapelled to their shirt collar would simply get in the way. Boundary microphones are excellent supplementary mics. They're cheap. You can see them used a lot as table mics when the subjects are stationary. These are especially practical for talking head videos when the room is really, really quiet, because you don't have to worry about the lavalier microphone rustling up against these subjects' clothing, and that's the advantage that a table mic has. It does pick up a little bit more ambient noise than would a lavalier mic, and that's simply because there's usually a larger gap between the microphone and the actual subject. Not much, but enough to pick up a little bit more room space. But for some scenarios where the room is extremely quiet, this is a really cheap alternative. It's also a great way to do multi-miking, or to simulate multi-miking. If you have multiple subjects, you have two people on camera, you can use a table mic and keep that out of frame, and it will pick up both of them reasonably well. Good cheap alternative to trying to get two lavalier mics on two different or more independent subjects. And of course we have wireless mics. These are very popular in professional productions. They tend to be one of the most expensive microphone options. There are some cheaper models available that certainly would be accessible to low-budget indie productions, but we tend to see this more on the higher end. Nevertheless, they're very appropriate for applications where the subject is mobile and where cables would be very, very cumbersome. Whatever you do, please use a windscreen, especially if you're shooting outdoors and there's any wind whatsoever. Wind can create distortion instantly, especially on on-camera microphones. A sock, even a cheap sock from your dresser drawer, will make your audio sound so much better. These windscreens are professional, the ones that you see here. They come in all shapes and sizes and price ranges. But as I said before, even a cheap sock will be better than using nothing at all. So please use a windscreen. Connectors. Here are a few different connection types that you need to be aware of. XLR is still an industry standard. It has received a lot of competition lately from USB, which is obviously a digital connective device. But the older technologies, quarter-inch and mini audio, are still prevalent. And the bottom line is you need to match the cable to the type of port that's accessible on your camera. Some of you don't have audio on your cameras, and that creates a conundrum, of course, and we've talked about that in some of our discussion forum posts and how we can use studio audio or different camera audio to get around that, especially if you have an SLR camera that shoots awesome video, but it doesn't have an audio in option, so you have to come up with a different strategy. But these are the typical connection cables that you used to get the microphone attached to the camera. Let's talk about strategies for cleaning up audio. We'll keep these really simple, and I have several videos that I want you to watch here that are going to reinforce these techniques. But at a very simplistic level, let's talk about the use of an external mic versus the built-in mic. We said before that the built-in mics tend to pick up a lot of undesirable noise. For example, you probably can't hear too well, but there's a jet flying right outside right now while I'm recording this. And had I been using a camera built-in mic, you would have heard that in detail, and I would have had to reshoot this because it would not have been usable. But because I'm using a USB mic, it's much less detectable. So, how's that for an opportune moment? I certainly couldn't have planned that. In any event, use an external mic is the simplest way I can put this, and make sure it's covered with a windscreen or a foam as appropriate. We haven't talked much about gain levels, but we need to. Most cheap cameras are going to have an auto gain function. Slightly better applications or better apps on some of your camera phones will have the ability to use a manual gain setting. And that simply means, if you take a look at this image up here, you can see where the arrow's pointing. There's a little radio dial for the volume level of the audio that you're recording. Many video capturing apps have a digital equivalent of that, so you need to look at the app that you're using if you're using your phone, or look on your camera to see if it has menu settings that will allow you to set the gain manually. This is really important because auto gain is not terribly accurate on many devices, and so you'll have to experiment to make sure that you get the quality that you want. So avoid, if possible, using auto gain and use manual gain instead. One of the reasons you want to use manual gain is so that you can adjust how loud the audio sounds as you're recording. If it's too loud, it's going to start clipping, and if you look in the image above here, you know what this means. Even if you haven't seen this for years, this is an old analog VU or volume unit meter that tells you how loud your source audio is. You know you don't want to be in the red, right? Because if you're in the red, it starts distorting. Well, the technical term for that distorting is called clipping. And clipping audio is really, really bad. It will sound horrible and is very undesirable. So make sure that you test your audio and look at the VU meter if you have one. If you don't, then you're going to have to listen to headphones and make sure that it sounds appropriate. If there's any clipping, if there's any peaking, if you hear P's really starting to pop, or if there's a crunch to your audio, you've got your gain setting way too high. So turn it down if you have the manual option activated. And if you don't, turn off the auto gain and use manual. And if you're stuck with auto gain, then make sure you record in a setting that's extremely quiet, where you're less likely to have these unpredictable loud noises. That's not always easy to control, but do the best that you can. That concludes this lesson on basic audio production. Please note that there are several additional videos that you need to watch on our course site to extend your understanding of what it takes to capture great audio in the field. And the follow-up homework assignment, of course, will give you an opportunity to practice some of these skills. Good luck, and I'll see you here next time.